I found myself standing on Main Street again last Tuesday, and the rain was falling exactly the way I remembered it. Not the same rain, obviously. Not the same drops that touched this pavement in 1977 or 1982 or any of the 1,000 rainy days I walked here when I was someone else entirely. But the same rhythm, the same patience, the same way it turned the street into mirrors, making everything that was solid look like it might dissolve if you stared at it long enough. I'd been gone 15 years. Moved away for work, for change, for all the reasons people leave cities they love but can't quite afford anymore. And in those 15 years, I thought about Main Street maybe 3 times. Maybe 4. Thought I'd moved on. Thought the city and I had finished our conversation and there was nothing left to say. But standing there with rain soaking through my jacket, watching the neon sign at the corner bleed red and blue across wet concrete, I understood something I'd been too young to know before. Places remember us even when we think we've forgotten them. The rain knows. It falls on what we were and what we are without making any distinction between the two. It touches the pavement we walked on at 20 and the pavement we're walking on now at 47, and to the rain, it's all the same surface. All the same story. All the same water returning to earth and rising again, over and over, carrying everything with it. I pulled my collar up and started walking, not sure where I was going but certain I needed to move. Needed to let my feet remember what my mind had tried to forget. Main Street, Portland, rain, the place that shaped me. The place I left. The place that never left me. Portland rain doesn't announce itself the way rain does in other places. There's no thunder rolling in from distant hills, no dramatic darkening of the sky, no moment when you can point and say that's when it started. Portland rain just arrives, quiet as breath, and settles in like it's been there all along and you're the one who just showed up. That's how it was when I turned onto Main Street from Morrison, my shoes already wet from the 6 blocks I'd walked from the bus stop. The rain had been falling for hours, maybe days. The kind of November rain that makes you forget there was ever a time when the ground was dry. The street looked wider than I remembered. Or maybe I'd gotten smaller. Perspective shifts when you've been away. Things that seemed enormous at 20 become manageable at 47, or maybe they don't change at all and you're just tired of being impressed by size. I walked slowly, letting my eyes adjust to all the small transformations. The buildings were the same brick and mortar, the same bones, but everything built on top of those bones had changed. New signs, new storefronts. New people moving past me with their heads down and their hands wrapped around paper coffee cups that cost more than I used to spend on an entire meal. But the rain was identical. It fell the same way it had in 1977 when I first moved to Portland. With $200 and a duffel bag and no plan except to be somewhere my parents weren't. Fell the same way it had in 1982 when I thought I understood the city and my place in it. Fell the same way it probably fell in 1952 and 1932 and every year before that. When this street was mud and horses and people who are all photographs now, all memory, all gone. The pavement was dark and slick, catching light from the street lamps that were just starting to glow even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. November does that in Portland. Pulls the darkness down early, makes the day feel like it's giving up before it's even properly started. But there's something comforting in it too. Something honest about a city that doesn't pretend to be sunnier than it is. I passed the place where Woolworths used to be. It's something else now, something expensive and carefully curated. All reclaimed wood and Edison bulbs and the kind of aesthetic that costs a fortune to look effortless. The window display was artful in a way Woolworths never was. Back then it was just practical chaos, selling everything from thread to light bulbs to greeting cards. All under fluorescent lights that hummed like they were annoyed at having to work. But the doorway was the same. Same 3 concrete steps. Same angle. I knew because I'd stood in that doorway once during a downpour so heavy the street became a river. That was spring of 1979, or maybe 1980. The years blur when you filter them through rain and time and the unreliable archive of memory. I could smell coffee everywhere. That hadn't changed. Portland has always smelled like coffee, like the entire city runs on caffeine and rain in equal measure. But the coffee was different now. More complicated, more expensive, more concerned with origin and roast level and whether the beans were ethically sourced. In 1977, coffee was just coffee, served in thick ceramic mugs that had been washed 10,000 times and looked it. And nobody asked questions beyond cream or sugar or black. Across the street, the Burnside Bridge hummed with traffic. That sound has been constant for as long as Portland has had cars. Tires on wet pavement, the occasional horn, the rhythmic thrum of the metal grating when heavier vehicles cross over. At night you can hear it from blocks away, this low pulse that reminds you the city is alive, is moving, is going somewhere even when you're standing still. The light was fading properly now, that quick transition from afternoon to evening that happens fast in November. The streetlights were all on, creating cones of illumination that made the rain visible. Turned it from something you just felt into something you could actually see. Individual drops catching light and falling through it. Thousands of them, millions of them, all of them temporary and all of them part of the same endless cycle. I stopped at the corner where Morrison crossed Main. This intersection used to have a payphone. I remember using it, feeding it quarters, listening to the mechanical sounds it made before connecting you to whoever you were trying to reach. The receiver was always sticky. The cord was always tangled. But it worked. It let you talk to people who weren't standing next to you, which seemed like magic if you thought about it too hard. The payphone is gone now. Has been for years, probably. There's just a rectangular scar on the concrete where the mounting bolts used to be. Everything leaves a mark. Everything that was here is still here in some form, even when the thing itself has disappeared. I kept walking, hands in my pockets, rain finding its way past my collar and down my neck. Cold but not unbearable. The kind of wet you learn to accept when you live in Portland. Fighting it is pointless. You just get wet and learn to be okay with being wet. And eventually you stop noticing the difference between dry and damp because damp becomes your natural state. There was a coffee shop on the next block with warm light spilling out onto the wet sidewalk. Through the window I could see people sitting alone with laptops, faces lit by screens, everyone in their own private bubble of productivity or distraction. Or whatever it is we do now instead of just sitting and thinking and watching the rain. The building looked familiar but I couldn't place it. Something used to be here. Something that mattered. But memory is selective and unreliable and sometimes it just gives you the feeling of recognition without providing any of the actual details. I walked past it, then stopped. Turned back. Looked at the corner where the building met the sidewalk. And that's when I saw it. A small metal plaque, probably 10 inches square, mounted near the foundation. Weathered brass with engraved letters that were filling with rain even as I read them. Vinyl Village Records, 1975 to 1982. And just like that, everything came back. Not slowly, not piece by piece, but all at once. The way a song can transport you completely when you haven't heard it in 20 years. The way a smell can put you back in a moment you thought you'd forgotten. The way rain can make time collapse until past and present are happening simultaneously and you're 20 years old and 47 at the same time. Standing in the same spot on different days in different bodies with different hearts but the same rain falling on both of you. The record store. The place I'd spent hundreds of hours when I was young and broke and convinced that music was the most important thing in the world. The place where I'd learned what I liked and what I didn't and how to be alone in a room full of people without feeling lonely. The building was still here, but the record store was gone. Transformed into this coffee shop with its clean lines and its Wi-Fi and its oat milk options. And I felt something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite nostalgia, but was somewhere between the two. A recognition of loss mixed with acceptance that loss is just how time works. The rain fell harder for a moment, then softened again. I stood there getting wetter, looking at the building that used to be something else, understanding that I'd come back to Main Street. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because I'd never really left. Because the person I was in 1977 was still here, still browsing records in a store that didn't exist anymore. Still young and uncertain and full of the kind of hope that comes from not yet knowing how things turn out. And the rain remembered her even if I sometimes forgot. The rain knew all of it. Every version of me who'd ever walked this street. Every person who'd ever stood under these awnings waiting for the storm to pass. Every conversation and goodbye and small moment that had happened here and would never happen again. But would also never entirely stop happening because memory is just another form of existence. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept walking, but slower now, paying more attention. Because Main Street wasn't just a street anymore. It was a timeline, a map. A physical space where all the years I'd lived here were layered on top of each other like transparencies. And if you knew how to look, if the rain was falling just right, you could see through the present to everything underneath. The pavement beneath my feet was the same pavement I'd walked on thousands of times before. Worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Cracked in places where winter had gotten in and done its work. Patched and repatched until the street was more repair than original surface, but still the same street, still Main Street, still here. And I was still here too. Different but the same. Changed but recognizable. Walking through rain that connected every version of me who'd ever been caught in a Portland downpour and understood that this was just how it was. How it would always be. Rain and pavement and the slow transformation of everything except the rain itself. I looked up at the sky and let the rain hit my face, cold and clean and exactly like I remembered. And I thought maybe this is what coming home means. Not going back to a place that stayed the same, but returning to a place that changed in parallel with you and recognizing yourself in the transformation. The street was different. I was different. But the rain was the same. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Vinyl Village opened sometime in the mid-70s, though I never knew the exact year and it never seemed important to ask. By the time I discovered it in the fall of 1977, it felt like it had always been there. Like some places do when they fit so perfectly into the shape of a neighborhood that you can't imagine the street without them. The shop sat on Burnside, tucked between a diner that served Maxwell House coffee in those thick white mugs that could survive being dropped on concrete, and a shoe repair place run by an old man who never looked up from his workbench no matter how long you stood at his counter. The storefront was narrow, maybe 15 feet across, with windows that were always slightly fogged from the temperature difference between the damp street and the warm interior. In the rain, which was most of the time, those windows would stream with water, turning the album covers displayed there into something abstract and beautiful. The colors would blur and run together, and you'd see the shape of faces or guitars or whatever was on the cover. But not the details, just the impression of music waiting to be heard. I was 20 the first time I walked through that door. 20 and convinced that everything important in life could be found in the grooves of a record if you just listened hard enough. I'd moved to Portland 3 months earlier with almost no money and no real plan, sleeping on a friend's couch in Southeast, working morning shifts at a bakery on Hawthorne. Where I came home every day smelling like yeast and sugar and the particular exhaustion that comes from waking up at 4 in the morning. The door had a bell. Not electronic, just a simple brass bell on a spring that rang when you pushed through. That sound became one of the most familiar sounds in my life for the next 5 years. The bright chime of arrival. The way it would ring again when the door closed behind you, sealing you into this warm, cluttered cave of music and possibility. Inside, the light was amber and soft, coming from old fixtures that probably hadn't been changed since the building was constructed in the 20s or 30s. The place had a glow to it, like being inside a photograph that had aged into warm tones. All the harshness filtered out by time and dust and the particular quality of light that comes through old glass. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with wooden bins. Records stood upright in rows, organized alphabetically within genres, though the owner had his own logic for certain sections that nobody questioned because it was his store and his system. And if you couldn't find what you were looking for, you could always ask or you could keep looking, and the looking was half the point anyway. The floor was wood, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and it creaked in specific places. You learned which boards made noise if you cared about moving quietly, though most of us didn't care. The creaking was part of the soundtrack, along with whatever was playing on the turntable that sat on the counter near the front window. The owner's name was Raymond. He was maybe 45 when I met him, though he could have been older. Hard to tell with some people. He had hair that was going gray in a way that looked intentional, and he wore flannel shirts in every season and glasses that were always sliding down his nose. He'd sit behind the counter reading paperbacks with cracked spines, looking up when you came in but rarely speaking unless you spoke first. He knew everything about every record in that shop. Who played drums on what session? Which pressing was better than the others? Whether the reissue was worth buying or if you should hold out for an original. But he never volunteered this information. You had to ask. The store wasn't about selling, not really. It was about something else. Curating, maybe. Or just providing a space where people could be around music without anyone demanding they buy something or leave. I went there 2 or 3 times a week that first year. Sometimes more. I'd finish my shift at the bakery around 1 in the afternoon, go home and shower and change out of my flour-dusted clothes, then catch the bus to Burnside. The rain would usually be falling by then, that steady Portland rain that's less like weather and more like the city's natural state. I'd push through the door and hear that bell and feel the warmth wrap around me, and for the next hour or 2 I'd just be there. Sometimes I bought something. A used album for $3, maybe $4 if it was in good condition. Mostly I just browsed, ran my fingers along the cardboard spines, pulled records out to look at the cover art, to read the liner notes, to see who wrote what song and who played on which tracks. There was a Fleetwood Mac poster on the wall behind the counter. Rumors. That album had come out in February of 1977 and by fall it was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. It played in every apartment, every car, every diner jukebox. The poster showed the band looking young and damaged and beautiful in that specific way. The 70s managed, all flowing clothes and complicated hair and eyes that suggested they knew things you didn't. Raymond kept that poster up for more than a year. I asked him once why he didn't change it, rotate in something new. He just shrugged and said he didn't believe in changing things just because time passed. Said if something still mattered, it still mattered, and that album still mattered. I listened to Rumors maybe 100 times that year. Not by choice always, just because it was ambient, it was everywhere. It was the soundtrack to 1977 in a way that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. Dreams and Go Your Own Way and The Chain. Songs that felt like they were about everyone's life. Even though they were really just about 5 people in a recording studio in California falling apart while making something beautiful. The record store smelled like old cardboard and vinyl and coffee. The coffee came from the diner next door, carried over in paper cups by people who'd order it to go and then bring it into Vinyl Village because Raymond didn't mind and the diner's owner didn't care as long as you bought the coffee from him first. The smell would mix with the dusty scent of old album sleeves and create this particular atmosphere that I can still recall perfectly if I close my eyes and concentrate. There was a listening station in the back corner. Headphones plugged into a turntable, a wooden stool to sit on, a lamp that cast a small circle of yellow light. You could preview albums before buying, though. The selection at the listening station was limited to whatever Raymond thought deserved serious attention that week. I spent hours there. The headphones were old, heavy, with foam cushions that had compressed over time and vinyl coating that flaked off in your hair. But the sound was good. You could hear everything. The breath before a vocal. The fingers sliding on guitar strings. The room sound from the studio. I discovered so much music that way. Albums I never would have bought blind but fell in love with after hearing them through those worn headphones. While rain tapped against the window and other customers moved through the shop with their own quiet purpose. The rain outside became part of the experience. You'd be listening to something slow and sad, something like Joni Mitchell's Blue or Nick Drake's Pink Moon, and you'd hear the rain in the background. Sometimes in rhythm with the music, sometimes counterpoint to it, and the two sounds would merge until you couldn't separate them. Music and rain. Rain and music. Both of them washing over you, cleaning something out, making space for whatever came next. I was 20 and 21 and 22 in that store. Young enough that the future still felt infinite, like I had unlimited time to figure out who I was going to be. And what I was going to do and whether any of it would matter. The record store felt like a safe place to wait while I figured those things out. Nobody rushed you. Nobody asked what you were doing with your life or why you spent so much time flipping through albums you couldn't afford. Raymond would put on something new when the old album finished. I remember a Saturday in December, probably 1978, when he played the Velvet Underground's third album start to finish. While the rain came down so hard it sounded like static on the roof. Nobody spoke. A few people browsed, but mostly we just stood there, letting the music and the rain combine into something that felt true and real and more important than anything happening outside those walls. That's what I remember most about Vinyl Village. Not any single visit but the accumulation of visits. The way it felt like a place outside regular time. Where you could be 20 years old and uncertain and broke and that was okay, that was allowed, that was maybe even the point. The light was always amber. The floor always creaked. The bell always rang. Raymond was always reading something. And the turntable was always spinning, sending music out into the dusty air where it mixed with coffee. Smell and rain sound and became part of the atmosphere, part of the architecture. Part of what made that place sacred in the way ordinary places sometimes are when they give you exactly what you need without asking anything in return. I'd leave when it got dark or when my feet got tired or when I remembered I had something else I was supposed to be doing. I'd push back out through that door and hear the bell ring goodbye and step into the rain that was still falling, would probably always be falling. And I'd walk to the bus stop with my head full of music and my pockets empty but feeling somehow wealthy anyway. And sometimes, standing outside under the awning, waiting for the rain to ease up or just waiting for whatever comes next, there'd be someone else. Another person in a dark coat, holding an umbrella, face turned slightly away from the street. I never asked why they waited there. Never found the right words or the right moment. But I noticed, started to expect it. This person under the red awning, part of the landscape of Burnside Street, part of what made that corner feel like it mattered. The rain would fall on both of us, on the awning between us, on the street and the buildings and the whole city laid out under gray sky. And inside the store, the turntable would keep spinning. The music would keep playing. And Portland would keep being Portland, one rainy afternoon at a time. There was someone who waited under the red awning outside Vinyl Village, and I never learned their name. Not in 5 years of seeing them there, off and on, standing in that same spot like they were part of the storefront itself. Like the awning and the brick and the fogged window, they were just another element of that corner. That street, that version of Portland I inhabited when I was young enough to think mystery was romantic instead of just incomplete information. I noticed them first in the winter of 1978. January, I think, though it might have been February. The rain that year was relentless even by Portland standards, and the streets were more water than pavement, the storm drains overwhelmed and useless. I'd been inside the store for maybe an hour, longer than I'd planned, losing track of time the way you do when you're flipping through records. And the outside world seems both very close and very far away. When I moved toward the front to leave, that's when I saw them through the fogged window. A figure under the awning, holding a large black umbrella. Wearing a long coat that might have been gray or dark blue, hard to tell through the distortion of rain and condensation. They stood very still, not like someone waiting impatiently for the rain to stop, but like someone who had settled in. Who was comfortable with waiting, who maybe even preferred it to arriving. I stood inside for another minute, watching. Watched the way the rain hit the umbrella and rolled off in streams. Watched the small movements, the shift of weight from one foot to the other, the slight adjustment of the umbrella's angle when the wind changed. Then I went back to browsing, and when I looked again 10 minutes later, they were gone. The second time I saw them was maybe 2 weeks later. I was approaching the store from the east, walking down Burnside in that steady rain. That's not quite heavy enough to make you run but not light enough to ignore. And there they were again, same spot, same umbrella, same quality of patient stillness. I had to pass within maybe 3 feet of them to reach the door. Close enough to smell cigarette smoke, not fresh but the lingering scent on clothing, mixing with rain and wet wool. Close enough to hear the rain hitting the umbrella fabric, that soft drumming that's different from rain hitting pavement or windows or your own jacket. I didn't look directly at them. Something about it felt like it would break an unspoken rule, like acknowledging them would change whatever this was into something that required explanation. So I kept my eyes forward, reached for the door, heard the bell ring as I pushed through. But I was aware of them. The way you're aware of weather. The way you know someone is in a room even when you can't see them. When all you have is the sense of another presence, another person occupying space, breathing the same air. Inside the store, I moved to the window and looked out. From this angle I could see them more clearly, though the fogged glass still created a filter, a softness. The umbrella had a curved wooden handle. The coat was definitely gray, long enough to reach mid-thigh. Their hair was dark, collar length, and when the wind shifted the rain under the awning, they'd turn their head slightly, adjust their position, protect themselves with small efficient movements. Raymond glanced up from his book, looked at me looking out the window, and went back to reading without comment. That was his way. Notice everything, remark on nothing unless asked. I wanted to ask if he knew who that was, if he'd seen them before, if they were waiting for someone or something specific. But asking felt like it would make the mystery concrete, would turn something that existed beautifully in uncertainty into an ordinary explanation that would disappoint us both. So I didn't ask, just kept noticing. And over the next few months, through the rest of that winter and into spring, they became part of my pattern. Part of what I looked for when I turned onto Burnside. Not every time I went to the store, but often enough. Maybe once every 3 or 4 visits. Maybe more. Memory compresses time, makes frequencies unreliable. Sometimes they'd be there when I arrived. Sometimes they'd appear while I was inside, and I'd see them through the window taking up their position. opening the umbrella with a practiced motion that suggested they'd done this hundreds of times. Sometimes I'd arrive and they'd just be leaving, a glimpse of gray coat disappearing around the corner. And I'd feel something that might have been disappointment, though I couldn't have said why. We developed a vocabulary of small gestures. A nod when I passed. The slight tilt of an umbrella in acknowledgement. The half-smile visible in profile when the light was right and the window wasn't too fogged. Nothing you could call conversation, but something more than ignoring each other. Something in between. I learned to read them without words. Could tell by the angle of their shoulders whether they'd been waiting long or had just arrived. Could gauge their mood, or thought I could, by how they held the umbrella, whether tense and close or relaxed and angled. Could sense when they were early in their vigil versus late in it, though I never knew what they were keeping vigil for. Once, in March when the rain had stopped for maybe an hour and the sun was trying to break through, I saw them without the umbrella. They stood in the same spot but looked different, less defined, like the umbrella had been part of their essential shape and without it. They were somehow more vulnerable, more human, more like someone I might actually speak to instead of just observe through glass. They lit a cigarette. I watched them cup the flame against wind that wasn't quite there yet, protecting the small fire the way you protect all fragile things. The smoke rose and dispersed in the damp air. They stood and smoked and watched the street, and I stood inside the store. Watching them watch the street, and for a moment I felt the strange intimacy of parallel observation, of both of us looking but from different sides of the same window. I wanted to go outside. Wanted to walk through that door and stand under the awning and say something simple like "It's nice when the rain stops." Or "I've seen you here before," or "What are you waiting for?" But I didn't. Stayed inside where it was safe and familiar, and the only risk was spending money I didn't have on records I didn't need. The moment passed. The rain started again. They opened the umbrella. And the pattern continued, week after week, month after month, into summer. When the awning provided shade instead of shelter, into fall when the rain came back heavy and constant. I learned their small rituals through observation. They always arrived from the west, from the direction of the river. Always stood to the left of the door, leaving the right side clear for people entering and exiting. Smoked maybe one cigarette every 20 minutes, cupping the lighter the same way each time. Never looked impatient. Never checked a watch, though I don't know if they wore one. Their shoes were brown leather, worn but cared for, the kind that would last years if you treated them right. The kind you bought if you walked everywhere, if you understood Portland weather and what it did to cheap shoes. I noticed them one day in late spring when I was leaving the store and looked down instead of straight ahead. And those shoes told me more than I'd learned in months of watching from inside. They were someone who stayed. Someone who didn't just pass through Portland but lived here, really lived here, understood the rain and made peace with it. Someone who knew which streets flooded and how to walk in wet weather and where the good awnings were. Sometimes our eyes would meet through the window. Just for a second. Just long enough to acknowledge that we both knew the other was there, was aware, was paying attention. Then we'd look away, the moment dissolving like rain into pavement, absorbed and gone but somehow still present in the way those brief connections always are. I thought about them more than I should have. More than made sense for someone I'd never spoken to. Whose name I didn't know, whose face I'd only seen in profile or through fogged glass or in the distorted reflection of rain-streaked windows. But mystery does that sometimes. Creates space for imagination. Lets you fill in the gaps with whatever you need them to be. Maybe they were waiting for someone who worked in one of the buildings nearby. Maybe they were waiting for rain to stop, though that seemed unlikely given how long they'd stand there even in the heaviest downpours. Maybe they were waiting for nothing, just occupying space, just being present in the way some people need to be present, in the in-between places. Under awnings, neither inside nor outside, neither arriving nor leaving. Or maybe they were like me. Coming to this street because it felt like a place where you could be uncertain and that was okay. Where you didn't have to know what you were doing or where you were going. Where waiting was valid. Where standing still in the rain was just as legitimate as moving with purpose toward a destination. The seasons changed. Spring became summer became fall. I turned 21. The record store stayed the same, Raymond stayed the same, the rain came and went and came back. And the person under the awning remained a constant presence, a question I carried without needing answered. Because maybe some connections exist best as questions, as small mysteries, as the space between speaking and silence where something can exist that's more than either one alone. I never learned their name, never asked why they waited, never broke the spell of our silent acknowledgement. And looking back now, standing on Main Street in the rain 40-some years later, I think maybe that was the point. Maybe the not knowing was the connection. Maybe we understood each other perfectly through our shared commitment. To being there, to showing up, to occupying that corner of Burnside Street in rain and sun and everything between. Two people, one inside, one outside, both waiting for something we couldn't name but recognized in each other. The rain falling on both of us. The window between us. The whole city breathing around us. And that being enough. More than enough. Everything. Raymond didn't announce it with any ceremony. Didn't put up a sign saying going out of business or everything must go. That wasn't his nature. One afternoon in late September 1982, he simply taped a small note in the window. White card, blue pen, handwritten in his careful script. Closing October 15th. That was all it said. I stood on the wet sidewalk reading those 3 words over and over, rain running down the back of my neck. Trying to make them mean something other than what they meant. Around me Burnside continued its usual rhythm. Cars passing. People hurrying past with newspapers held over their heads. The diner next door with its steamed windows and the eternal smell of coffee and bacon. Everything normal except for those 3 words that changed everything. Inside, the store looked the same at first glance. Same amber light. Same wooden bins. Same turntable playing something soft, maybe Chet Baker, maybe Bill Evans, something instrumental that wouldn't demand too much attention. But when you looked closer, you could see the small signs. Gaps in the bins where records used to be. A stack of flattened cardboard boxes near the counter. A certain quality of stillness that spaces get when they know they're being left behind. Raymond was at the counter but he wasn't reading. He was sorting through receipts, organizing them into piles. With the methodical patience of someone who'd decided to do things properly even though it no longer mattered. He looked up when the bell rang, nodded once, went back to his papers. I wanted to ask why. Wanted to ask what happened, whether it was money or landlord trouble or just exhaustion. With the slow decline of physical media, with the way people were starting to want cassettes more than vinyl, something smaller and more portable and less precious. But the answer was probably all of those things and none of them mattered. The store was closing. That was the fact. Everything else was just explanation. I started coming every day after that. Not to buy, though I bought what I could afford, which wasn't much. I came because I needed to witness it. Needed to be present for the ending the way you need to be present at funerals, standing there. Acknowledging that something is finishing, something is being lost, something will never be this way again. The bins got emptier as October progressed. The regular customers came and picked through what remained, carrying away pieces of what the store had been. The collectors came too, the serious ones who knew about pressings and matrix numbers and showed up with lists of what they were looking for. Raymond sold to all of them without sentiment, just transactions, albums. Changing hands for money that would pay final bills and maybe leave enough for whatever came next. The posters came down. The Fleetwood Mac one that had been up for over a year got carefully removed, leaving a clean rectangle of wall that looked wrong, too bright, like skin that had never seen sun. Other posters followed. Bob Dylan, The Velvet Underground, local bands whose names I'd forgotten. The walls got barer. The store got larger somehow, the empty space more prominent than what remained. I helped pack boxes when Raymond would let me. We didn't talk much, just worked in the comfortable silence of people who understood that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is just be present without trying to make the moment something other than what it is. I'd pull records from bins and stack them carefully in boxes, organized by genre the way Raymond had always organized them. And he'd tape the boxes shut with that brown packing tape that sounds like tearing when you pull it off the roll. The rain that October was constant. Not heavy, just steady, the kind of rain that settles in for weeks and makes you forget the sun ever existed. It streamed down the windows, blurred the street outside, turned everything gray and soft and slightly unreal. The store felt even more like a cave, a warm dry place in a world made entirely of water. I noticed the person under the awning was there more often those last 2 weeks. Almost every time I came to the store, they were outside, umbrella up, standing in their usual spot. The waiting had a different quality now. Less like anticipation and more like vigil. Like they were keeping watch, making sure the ending happened with someone bearing witness who understood what was being lost. We never spoke about it. Still didn't speak at all, actually. Just the same small acknowledgements. The nod when I passed. The tilt of the umbrella. But there was something different in those gestures now. A shared recognition of ending. A mutual understanding that we were both saying goodbye to something that had mattered. The listening station came down on October 10th. Raymond unplugged the turntable, wrapped the headphones in newspaper, packed them in a box marked for storage or donation. Or wherever things go when their usefulness is finished. I watched him do it and felt something in my chest tighten, some small grief for all the hours I'd spent in that corner. All the music I'd discovered there, all the versions of myself who'd sat on that wooden stool trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted and whether any of it would ever make sense. 3 days before the final closing, the neon sign started flickering. It had been solid for as long as I'd known the store, steady red letters spelling out Vinyl Village with a small green record underneath. But that afternoon the V in vinyl started stuttering, on and off, on and off. Like it was trying to communicate something in code or maybe just giving up in stages. Raymond called someone to look at it. They came, examined it, said the parts were discontinued and repairs would cost more than the sign was worth. Raymond thanked them and sent them away. Said it seemed appropriate somehow. Everything ending together. The store and its sign and this whole era of what music meant and how people found it. By October 14th, the day before the final closing, there were only a few boxes left. Raymond's personal collection, records he'd kept separate from the store inventory and was now reclaiming. Everything else was gone. The bins stood empty, geometric wooden skeletons that would be picked up the following week by whoever bought them. The walls were bare. The floor looked larger and more worn without all those records and bodies to fill it. I came in that last afternoon and found Raymond sitting behind the counter with the turntable in front of him, still plugged in. He'd kept it for this one last album. He didn't tell me what he was going to play. Just pulled it from his personal box and set it on the platter with the careful attention he'd always given to these small rituals. Billie Holiday, Lady in Satin. The one she recorded near the end, when her voice was nearly destroyed, when all the drugs and alcohol and hard living had worn it down to something raw and honest and almost unbearably beautiful in its brokenness. We stood there and listened. Didn't speak. Didn't move except to breathe and shift our weight and exist in the presence of this music that was about loss and damage and continuing anyway. The rain outside provided a second rhythm, counterpoint to Billy's ruined voice, and together they filled the empty store with something that felt like both goodbye and continuation. When the album finished, Raymond lifted the needle and turned off the turntable. The silence was complete. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then he started packing it up, wrapping it in that day's newspaper, October 14, 1982, headlines about interest rates and elections and all the ordinary catastrophes that make up regular time. I helped him load the last boxes into his car parked in the alley behind the store. The rain had picked up, heavier now, and we both got soaked carrying things out. The cardboard went soft. The newspaper wrapping darkened with moisture. But we got it done, and then we stood there in the alley, rain falling on both of us, not sure what to say or how to mark this ending. Raymond looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached out and shook my hand, formal and final, and said thank you for being here. That was all. Just thank you for being here. Like my presence had mattered. Like witnessing had value. I walked back around to the front of the building. The person under the awning was still there, had been there all afternoon, keeping their vigil. They moved closer to the door as I approached, and for the first time in 5 years. We stood close enough that I could see their face clearly, could see that they were maybe my age or a little older, could see that their eyes were gray or blue and held something that looked like understanding. Raymond came around from the alley, locked the back door for the final time, then walked to the front where we both stood waiting. He looked at the person under the awning, really looked at them, seemed to be seeing them for the first time. Even though they'd probably been there as long as I had, maybe longer. He nodded to them. They nodded back. Then he unlocked the front door one last time, went inside, and began turning off the lights. Not all at once. One by one, moving through the store, pulling chains and flipping switches. The back room went dark. The corner where the listening station had been. The space where the jazz bins had stood. Each section of the store disappearing into shadow until only the front lights remained. He stood at the door with his hand on the final switch. Looked at the empty store one last time. Flipped the switch. The amber light died. The store was gray now, lit only by the failing daylight. Coming through fogged windows and the flickering neon sign outside that had maybe another few hours before it too would give up completely. Raymond stepped outside, locked the door with a key that would no longer matter after today. And the sound of that lock clicking into place was final in a way I hadn't expected. Done. Finished. Over. He walked to his car without looking back. The person under the awning and I stood there watching as his taillights disappeared around the corner onto 3rd. And then it was just the two of us, standing outside a locked door, looking at a building that would never again be what it had been. They turned to me, spoke for the first time. Their voice was softer than I expected, lower, worn smooth by time or use or rain. I used to work here, they said. Long time ago. Before Raymond. Before it was a record store. My father ran a bookshop here when I was young. I just liked remembering what it was. Who we were. They closed the umbrella. Shook the water off. Looked at the dark windows one last time. Take care, they said. Then they walked away, west toward the river, and I stood there alone under the awning that would be removed next week. Watching the street blur in the rain, understanding finally that some waiting isn't about arrival. It's about honoring what was. Making sure the ending has weight. Making sure someone remembers. The neon sign flickered 3 more times. Then went dark completely. The rain kept falling. And Burnside Street kept being Burnside Street, indifferent to what had been lost, ready for whatever came next, the rain. Washing everything clean and carrying it all downstream toward the river, toward the ocean, toward wherever things go when they finish being what they were and become only memory. The 80s happened gradually and then all at once. That's how change works when you're living inside it. You don't notice the single moments, the individual shifts. One store closes, another opens, a sign comes down, a building gets painted, someone you used to see every week stops appearing. The coffee gets more expensive. The faces on the street get younger or you get older, or both things happen simultaneously and you can't tell which is the variable and which is the constant. But then one day you're standing on a corner you've stood on 100 times and nothing looks the same. Or worse, you can't quite remember what it looked like before. Can't separate what was from what is, can't locate the exact moment when the transformation became complete. After Vinyl Village closed, I kept walking Burnside. Kept coming downtown even though my reason for being there had disappeared. Habit is powerful that way. The body remembers roots long after the mind forgets why they mattered. I'd take the bus from my apartment, get off at the same stop, walk the same blocks, looking for something I couldn't name. The record store space stayed empty that first winter. The windows were soaped over from the inside, and you couldn't see in anymore, couldn't watch the emptiness where music used to be. Then spring came and brought a law office. Frosted glass. Brass plaque. The red awning came down. The neon sign was removed, leaving shadows on the brick where the mounting brackets had been bolted for 7 years. The space where someone used to wait became just sidewalk, no different from any other section of concrete. And I stopped going to that corner as often because there was nothing left to return to except the memory of return. I was 25 in 1982, 28 in 1985. 30 in 1987. The years moved faster than they had when I was 20, each one feeling shorter than the last, like time was accelerating towards some destination I couldn't see but could sense approaching. I worked different jobs through those years. Left the bakery in 1983 for data entry at an insurance company. Sat at a desk 8 hours a day typing numbers into a computer with a green screen that hurt your eyes if you looked at it too long. The work was mindless but the pay was better, and by then I'd learned that interesting work didn't pay the bills any more reliably than boring work. So you might as well take the money and find meaning somewhere else. The city changed around me faster than I could track. The independent stores that had defined downtown in the 70s, the places that had given each block its particular character, they closed one after another. The shoe repair shop became a chain drugstore. The diner became a Starbucks in 1985, one of the first in Portland, and the coffee improved but cost 3 times as much and tasted like progress. Which is to say, it tasted like something was being lost even as something else was gained. I went into that Starbucks once. Sat at a table that was bolted to the floor in a way the old mismatched chairs never were. Everything was clean and new and designed to look casual while actually being precisely calculated. I drank my expensive coffee and left and didn't go back, not out of principle. But because it didn't feel like mine, didn't feel like a place where you could sit for 2 hours with a single cup getting cold while you read or thought or just watched the rain. The payphones disappeared in waves. The one on the corner of Morrison and Main was removed in 1986. One day it was there, solid and permanent. The next day just the scar on the concrete and the junction box painted over but visible if you knew where to look. All through the late 80s they vanished, those blue and silver boxes that had connected us when we were separate. And nobody seemed to notice or care or understand that something was ending, some way of being in the world was becoming impossible. Not that it mattered much by then. People were starting to carry phones. Not everyone, not yet, but enough that you'd see them on the street, businessmen with brick-sized devices pressed to their ears. Talking to invisible people, looking important in a way that felt performative and slightly absurd. I didn't understand the appeal. Didn't want to be reachable everywhere, all the time. Liked the separation between being home and being out in the world. Liked that some hours of the day you were simply unreachable and that was acceptable, expected even. But I was aging out of understanding. Could feel it happening year by year. The references flew past me. The music changed into something I didn't recognize, synthesizers and drum machines. Replacing guitars and pianos, everything sounding processed and artificial and deliberately cold. MTV existed and apparently mattered, though I didn't have cable and wasn't sure I wanted to watch music instead of just listening to it. My coworkers got younger. Or I got older. They talked about bands I'd never heard of, referenced television shows I didn't watch, understood technology I found confusing. The computers at work upgraded every few years, got faster and more complicated. Required training sessions where 20-year-olds would explain with infinite patience how the new system worked, and I'd nod and take notes and feel ancient at 32, at 35, at 37. Portland itself was transforming into something cleaner and more expensive and less recognizable. The graffiti that used to cover walls downtown got painted over faster. The homeless people who'd always been part of the landscape got pushed to the edges, to Old Town and out past the river. Where the city gave up pretending it was beautiful. Buildings that had been worn and honest got renovated into sleek, expensive versions of themselves. And the rent went up, and people like me who'd come here in the 70s because it was cheap and weird and didn't demand much, we found ourselves priced out of the neighborhoods we'd thought we'd claimed. I moved twice in the 80s. Had to. First apartment got converted to condos in 1984. Second one raised the rent so high in 1988 that I had to find something cheaper, which meant farther out, which meant longer bus rides. Which meant less connection to the city I'd thought I knew. Each move took me further from downtown, from Burnside, from the geography that had defined my 20s. And each time I moved, I got rid of things. Books, records, the accumulated weight of living. Not because I wanted to, but because smaller apartments meant less room for the past. The rain stayed constant through all of it. That was the one thing that didn't change. Still fell the same way. Still turned the streets into mirrors. Still made the city soft and gray and contemplative. While everything else transformed, while stores changed and streets changed. And I changed, the rain remained exactly itself, indifferent and eternal and somehow comforting in its absolute reliability. I dated occasionally through those years. A man named David in 1984 who worked at Powell's Books. We'd have dinner on Thursdays, see movies on weekends, sleep together in his apartment that smelled like old paper and coffee. It was pleasant, safe, but it didn't last. Nothing seemed to last. He moved to Seattle in 1985 for a job, and we talked about continuing long distance. But both of us knew it was over, and the ending was gentle and mutual, and somehow that made it sadder than if it had been dramatic. A woman named Sarah in 1987. That lasted longer, almost a year, and felt more serious, more like it might become something permanent. But somewhere around month 10 I realized I was going through the motions, performing relationship rather than feeling it. And it wasn't fair to her, wasn't fair to either of us. So I ended it, and she asked why, and I couldn't give her a good answer because I didn't have one. Just had this sense that I was meant to be alone, that solitude was my natural state and everything else was just temporary accommodation. The technology kept advancing. Walkman radios became universal in the mid-80s. Everyone wore headphones, moved through the streets in their own private soundtracks. I got one in 1986, tried it for a while, but it felt wrong. Isolating. Like I was removing myself from the city instead of moving through it. I preferred the ambient sound, the rain and traffic and random conversations. The proof that other people existed and I was part of something larger than myself even when I felt most alone. CDs started replacing vinyl. People talked about how much better they sounded, how you could skip tracks, how they didn't scratch or wear out. All true, all missing the point. But I couldn't articulate what the point was, so I stayed quiet and watched the record stores that remained slowly convert their stock from vinyl to those small plastic discs that felt like toys, that had no weight, no presence, no ritual of handling. By 1990 I was 33. The same age my mother had been when I was born, which seemed impossible. I didn't feel grown up enough to be the age my mother had been when she was raising a child, running a household, being responsible for another human life. I could barely manage my own life, could barely get to work on time and pay my bills and remember to eat vegetables. The city I'd moved to at 20 didn't exist anymore. Or it existed only in memory, which might be the same as not existing at all. The streets had the same names. The buildings were the same structures. But everything built on top of those bones had transformed so completely that navigating by memory became impossible. I'd think I was going to a place I knew, and I'd arrive and find it was something else now. Some chain store or expensive boutique or restaurant that required reservations. Powell's books kept expanding. By 1990 it occupied an entire city block, had become a destination for tourists, had transcended being just a bookstore and become a Portland landmark. I still went sometimes but less often. It was too crowded, too much noise, too many people treating it like an attraction instead of a place to find books. The quiet browsing I'd loved felt impossible when you had to navigate through crowds and the coffee shop inside had a line that stretched to the poetry section. I walked to the river sometimes instead. The Willamette, brown and patient, carrying everything downstream. I'd stand on the seawall and watch the water move and feel time moving the same way. Constant and inevitable, carrying all of us toward whatever came next whether we were ready or not. The rain fell on the river and the river accepted it, merged it into its larger motion, carried it toward the ocean. And I'd stand there getting wet, thinking about Vinyl Village and the person under the awning and all the versions of myself I'd left behind on streets that didn't remember me because streets don't remember. They just continue, just keep being streets while everything built on them transforms and falls away and gets replaced by something newer and shinier and more expensive. I turned 35 in 1992. The decade was almost over. The 90s were happening, though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant or how they were different from the 80s. Except that everyone seemed to be wearing different clothes and the music had changed again and the coffee had gotten even more complicated. But the rain was still rain. Still fell the same way it had in 1977 and 1982 and would fall in 2002 and 2022 and every year between and after. And standing on Main Street in the rain, older now and less certain, but somehow more accepting, I understood that the rain was the only constant, the only thing I could rely on to be exactly what it had always been. Everything else was change, everything else was transformation, everything else was the slow inevitable process of becoming something other than what it had been. But the rain remembered, and that would have to be enough. I came back to Main Street on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 25 years after I'd stopped coming regularly. Not by design. Not because I'd been planning to return, marking the date on a calendar, building up to some grand moment of reckoning with the past. Just circumstance. A doctor's appointment downtown that ended early. Rain falling the way it always falls in Portland. An hour to kill before the next bus home. And my feet, without consulting my brain, turning onto Main Street like they remembered the route even though I'd forgotten I still knew it. I was 67 years old. The number felt impossible. The person who'd browsed records at Vinyl Village, who'd been 20 and broke and certain music was the most important thing in the world. She felt like someone I'd read about in a book written by someone else. But here I was. Gray hair. Reading glasses on a chain. Walking shoes because anything else hurt my feet. A rain jacket that cost more than my entire wardrobe had in 1977 and worked better, kept me drier, made me look like I belonged in this version of Portland. Even though I felt like a ghost visiting from another decade entirely. The street looked nothing like I remembered and exactly like I remembered, both things true at the same time. The bones were the same. The brick buildings. The width of the sidewalk. The way the street sloped slightly toward the river. But everything built on those bones had transformed. The storefronts were different. The signs were different. The people were different, younger, moving faster, staring at phones that would have seemed like science fiction in 1982. I walked slowly. My knees weren't what they used to be. My balance required more attention. But I walked, letting the street reveal itself, watching for landmarks that might still exist, fragments of what was embedded in what is. The rain fell steadily. Not heavy, just persistent, the way Portland rain always is in November. It darkened the pavement, made everything reflective, turned the street into a surface that held light and threw it back distorted. My umbrella was adequate but not elegant. One of those compact ones that fold down small, designed for convenience rather than durability. Not like the real umbrellas people used to carry, the kind built to last, the kind you'd repair instead of replace. I passed where Woolworths had been. It was something else now, something I didn't recognize, some boutique selling things I couldn't afford and didn't need. The diner was gone too. The shoe repair shop. The whole block had been scrubbed clean and repainted and turned into a version of itself that catered to people with more money and different priorities. But the rain didn't care. Fell on the expensive boutiques the same way it had fallen on Woolworths. Fell on the people in their North Face jackets the same way it had fallen on people in thrift store coats. Treated everything equally. Past and present, just different names for the same surface receiving the same water. I stopped at the corner where the record store had been. Had to check the address to be sure because nothing about it looked familiar. The building was the same structure, same brick, but it had been renovated so thoroughly it might as well be new. Big clean windows, modern signage. And inside, through that glass, I could see people sitting at tables with laptops, drinking coffee from ceramic cups. Existing in a space that used to be something else but showed no sign of remembering what. A cafe. Of course. What else would it be? I stood outside for longer than was reasonable, rain falling on my umbrella, people navigating around me like I was an obstacle, which I suppose I was. An old woman blocking the sidewalk, staring at a building, seeing things that weren't there anymore. Seeing record bins where there were now cafe tables. Seeing amber light where there was now bright modern LED. Seeing Raymond behind a counter where there was now a young barista with tattoos and a carefully trimmed beard. The awning was gone. The red canvas that had sheltered someone who waited. Just a modern overhang now, metal and glass, efficient and characterless. No place to stand and smoke. No place to wait for something that might never arrive. I almost kept walking, almost continued down the street and caught my bus and went home and let the past stay past. But something made me stop. Some need to complete the circle. Some sense that I'd come this far and might as well go inside. Might as well see what the space had become, might as well stand where I used to stand and feel the difference between then and now. The door opened automatically. No bell. No brass chime announcing arrival. Just a soft whoosh of warm air and the smell of coffee. Darker and richer and more complex than Maxwell House, than anything we drank in the 70s when coffee was just coffee and didn't require a degree in chemistry to order. The space inside was completely different and somehow exactly the same. Different because everything was new, designed, intentional. The lighting, the furniture, the arrangement of tables, nothing accidental, nothing worn smooth by use. Everything curated for an aesthetic I understood intellectually but didn't feel emotionally. But the same because the dimensions were identical. The same square footage, the same distance from door to back wall, the same window looking out on Burnside. Stand in the right spot and you could almost see through the present to the past, could almost overlay memory on reality and make them match. The barista smiled at me. Young, maybe 25, friendly in that professional service industry way that's genuine but also trained. Asked what I wanted to order and I looked at the menu board, overwhelmed by options that hadn't existed when coffee was just coffee. Nothing was simple anymore. Everything had modifiers and options and choices that required decisions I wasn't prepared to make. Sizes weren't sizes, they were Italian words. Milk wasn't just milk, it was whole or skim or oat or almond or soy. Coffee wasn't coffee, it was espresso or americano or pour over or cold brew, and each of those had subcategories and variations. I asked for black coffee, medium size, to stay. Simple as I could make it. Paid with a card, just tapping it against the reader. And even that was different from how money used to work, from counting out bills and coins and waiting for change. Everything was faster now, more efficient. Less tactile, less connected to the physical reality of exchange. The coffee came in a ceramic cup. Heavy, well made. They'd poured something into the top, foam formed into a leaf pattern that would disappear as soon as I drank. Beautiful and temporary, like everything else. I found a seat by the window. The same window where records used to be displayed, where I used to stand with cold coffee watching the person under the awning. The glass was different now, bigger, cleaner, better insulated. But the angle was the same. The view was the same. Through it I could see Burnside exactly as I used to see it, just 45 years later. The rain continued. People passed with umbrellas or without them, the young ones mostly without, treating rain like something to endure rather than accept. But the basic pattern was the same. People moving through the city. Going somewhere, coming from somewhere, occupying the space between arrival and departure, just like always, just like forever. I sipped the coffee. It was good. Better than good, technically. But it didn't taste like memory. Didn't taste like sitting in the old diner with a book I wasn't reading, killing time until it was reasonable to walk to the record store. Just tasted like expensive coffee in 2024. Which was fine. Which was what it was. An older woman sat down at the table next to mine. Maybe 70, maybe older. She ordered something complicated, something with oat milk and vanilla and specifications I didn't catch. When it arrived, she didn't drink it right away. Just held it and looked out the window at the rain. I wondered if she remembered this street before. If she'd lived in Portland long enough to have a before. Or if she was new, one of the thousands who'd moved here in the last decade. Drawn by reputation and livability rankings and the promise of a city that was still affordable, though that was becoming less true every year. She commented to me, not looking directly but clearly speaking in my direction, that the rain wasn't stopping. I agreed with her that it never did, and she smiled at that, seemed to understand what I meant. She asked how long I'd lived here and I told her since the 70s, a long time. She said I must have seen it change and I said everything changes, which seemed like the only true answer. She nodded at that, sipped her complicated coffee, then told me her daughter kept insisting she should move somewhere cheaper, Boise. Maybe or somewhere like that, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Said it was the rain, that you get used to it, and I agreed that you do. That simple exchange seemed to capture something essential about Portland, about staying. When everything else tells you to go, about finding comfort in weather that most people would consider miserable. We sat in silence after that. Comfortable. Two old women watching rain through a window where records used to be displayed. Where someone used to wait. Where the city used to be something else but was always, essentially, itself. The coffee cooled in my hands. Outside, the light was fading even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. November in Portland. Dark by 5. Rain until morning. The rhythm of it unchanging even as everything built on top of it transformed. I thought about the years between then and now. The jobs. The apartments. The people I'd known briefly and forgotten. The slow accumulation of days that added up to a life I hadn't planned but had somehow lived anyway. Not a bad life. Not the life I'd imagined at 20. But mine. Real. Counted. And I thought about the person under the awning. Wondered where they were now. If they were still alive. If they'd ever come back to this corner and tried to see through the present to the past the way I was doing now. If our silent acknowledgement had meant something to them or if it was just a detail, minor and forgettable, lost in the larger story of their life. Probably forgotten. That seemed most likely. We build significance where none exists. Project meaning onto random proximity. Tell ourselves stories about connection when we're really just occupying the same space at the same time, ships passing without ever truly seeing each other. But maybe not. Maybe sometimes the small things matter. Maybe the person who waits while you browse. Maybe the nod through fogged glass. Maybe the recognition that someone else is there, witnessing the same rain, occupying the same moment. Maybe that's connection enough. The rain picked up. Heavy now. Loud enough to hear inside even through the modern windows with their good insulation. The street blurred. The reflections on wet pavement became abstract. Shapes and colors bleeding into each other the way they used to, the way they always do. When rain and light and glass combine to make the world soft and uncertain. I finished my coffee. Set the cup down. Looked at the window and saw my reflection superimposed on the street beyond. An old woman in a good rain jacket. Gray hair. Glasses. Face marked by years and gravity and the slow patient work of time. Behind my reflection, the city continued. Traffic. Rain. People hurrying. The endless motion of a place that never stops becoming itself. I stood up slowly. Joints protesting. Body reminding me it was 67 years old and had carried me through decades of walking and sitting and surviving. I pulled on my jacket. Picked up my umbrella. The woman at the next table looked up and smiled. Wished me dry travels in the rain, and I returned the sentiment, though we both knew staying dry in Portland November was more aspiration than achievable goal. Outside, the rain soaked through my jacket within seconds. The umbrella helped but not enough. Nothing was ever enough. But I walked anyway, slowly, carefully, down Main Street toward the bus stop. Past storefronts I didn't recognize. Past people I'd never meet. Through a city that was home and foreign at once. And the rain fell. The rain remembered. The rain knew. Everything else could change. Everything else could transform and disappear and become something new. But the rain would always be exactly what it had always been. And somehow, standing on the corner waiting for the bus, getting wetter by the second, I found that comforting. The rain was constant. And that was enough. I didn't leave the cafe right away. Didn't get up and catch my bus and go home to the apartment where I'd lived for the last decade, where everything was familiar and predictable and safe. Instead I sat there, watching the rain, watching the reflections in the window merge and separate and merge again. Feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name but recognized as important. The rain had picked up even more, heavy enough now that the people passing outside moved faster. Hunched against the weather, umbrellas tilted forward like shields. The sound of it against the glass was steady and hypnotic. A rhythm that could put you to sleep if you let it, could make time disappear if you stopped paying attention to its passage. I watched a young couple run past, laughing, both of them soaked, neither of them carrying an umbrella or seeming to care that they were getting drenched. They splashed through a puddle together and the water went everywhere and they laughed harder, and I felt something watching them. Not envy exactly. Not longing for youth or romance or the carelessness that comes from not yet knowing how quickly things can end. Just recognition. I'd been that wet once. That unconcerned with staying dry. That certain that what mattered was the person next to you, not the weather falling on both of you. The cafe was warmer now, more people having come in to escape the rain, and the windows had started to fog at the edges, creating a frame of white around the clear center. Through that clear space I could see the street, and in the glass itself, I could see the reflection of the cafe interior behind me, and both images existed simultaneously, layered on top of each other, neither one more real than the other. That's when I started to understand something I'd been circling around for 45 years without quite grasping. Something about how memory works. How the past persists. How nothing actually disappears even when we think it's gone. The record store was still there. Not physically. Not in any way you could touch or enter or point to and say, look, there it is. But it existed in the way I saw this space. In the dimensions I remembered. In the overlay of what was on top of what is. I could see both at the same time if I let my focus soften, if I stopped trying to see one thing clearly and instead let everything blur together. The wooden bins full of records were still there, occupying the same space as the cafe tables but in a different layer of time. Raymond was still there behind his counter, reading his paperback, looking up when someone came in, going back to his book. The amber light was still there, warm and dusty, mixing with the bright LED of the present. The turntable was still spinning. The bell was still chiming. All of it happening simultaneously with the cafe and its laptops and its complicated coffee drinks and its carefully curated aesthetic. Time wasn't linear the way I'd always thought. Wasn't a line moving from past through present toward future. It was layered, stacked. All of it happening at once in the same space, separated only by our limited ability to perceive more than one moment at a time. The person under the awning was still there too. Still waiting. Still standing with their black umbrella and gray coat. Still part of the landscape of Burnside Street. I couldn't see them through the window because the awning was gone, but they were there anyway, in the space where waiting used to happen, in the dimension. Where all the waiting that ever occurred on that corner was still occurring, forever, in the eternal present tense of having happened. And I was still there. 20 years old, 30, 40, all of those versions of me standing in the record store, sitting by windows, walking in the rain. They hadn't gone anywhere, hadn't ceased to exist just because time had moved forward. They were still doing what they'd always done, still being who they'd always been, still occupying their particular moment while I occupied mine. The rain was what connected it all. The rain fell then and falls now and will fall tomorrow, and it's the same rain, the same water cycling through the same sky. Touching the same pavement that's been repaved a dozen times but is still, essentially, the same surface. The rain doesn't distinguish between decades. Doesn't care if it's 1977 or 2024. Just falls, patient and eternal, witnessing everything, remembering everything, carrying all of it forward in its endless cycle. I felt my chest tighten, not with sadness but with something bigger, something that encompassed sadness but wasn't limited to it. A sense of the enormity of time. The weight of all those years. The miracle and burden of having lived long enough to see everything change while remaining somehow, essentially, myself. An older man at a table across from me was working on a laptop. His fingers moving across the keys with practiced efficiency, and I wondered what he was writing or calculating or creating. Wondered if he'd lived in Portland long enough to remember when this was a record store. Wondered if he ever thought about the layers of time stacked beneath his table. All the people who'd stood in this exact spot browsing through vinyl, all the moments that had occurred here before his moment arrived. Probably not. Most people don't think that way. Don't have the time or inclination to consider the archaeology of space, the way every location holds its own history. Visible only to those who remember or those who learn to look for the traces. But I thought about it. Couldn't stop thinking about it. Because I was 67 and I'd spent so many years believing that the past, was finished. Was something that existed only in the increasingly unreliable archive of memory. And I'd mourned that. Mourned the loss of the record store and the person who waited. And my younger self and all the versions of Portland that had been paved over and painted over and transformed into something unrecognizable. But sitting there, watching rain and reflections blend in the window, I understood that I'd been wrong. The past wasn't lost. It was here, right here, occupying the same space I was occupying, just in a different frequency, a different wavelength, a different layer of the same reality. Nothing disappears. It just changes form, changes state, like water becoming ice, becoming vapor, becoming rain again. The substance remains, only the shape shifts. The record store had become a cafe. The person under the awning had become memory. My 20-year-old self had become this 67-year-old woman sitting by a window on a rainy afternoon. But none of those earlier forms had ceased to exist. They'd just transformed, moved into a different relationship with the present, became past without becoming absent. I thought about physics, about the law of conservation of energy. How it states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. Maybe the same was true of everything. Maybe nothing ever really ended. Just transformed. Just became something else while remaining, fundamentally, what it had always been. The rain intensified for a moment, then softened again, finding its rhythm, and I watched the patterns it made on the glass. Random but somehow ordered, chaotic but somehow intentional, each drop following the path of least resistance, joining with other drops. Creating streams that ran down the window and disappeared into the frame, back into the larger system of water and sky and rain that had no beginning and no end, just endless circulation. That's what we are, I thought. Just drops in a larger pattern. Just moments in a longer story. We fall and run and merge and separate and eventually return to where we started. And the whole time we think we're moving forward when really we're just part of a cycle so large we can't see its shape. The woman who'd sat next to me earlier had left at some point. I hadn't noticed when. The table was empty now, her complicated coffee cup gone, no trace that she'd been there except my memory of the exchange. We'd had the small moment of connection between strangers who understood rain and Portland and the stubbornness of staying in a place that keeps changing. That memory would fade eventually. Would become less clear, less detailed, until one day I wouldn't remember her at all. But that didn't mean the moment hadn't happened. Didn't mean it hadn't mattered. Just meant it would transform into something else. Some general sense of having connected with someone, some vague recollection of a conversation about rain, some feeling without specific content. And maybe that was okay. Maybe that was how things were supposed to work. Specific memories fading into general impressions, fading into mood, fading into nothing except the faint residue of having occurred. Like how old photographs fade when exposed to light, the images becoming lighter and lighter until they're just ghosts of themselves. Suggestions of faces and places you once knew. But even the ghosts were real. Even the suggestions mattered. Even the faint traces were evidence of existence, of having been here, of having participated in the world for however long we were given. The light outside was failing properly now, that quick November transition from afternoon to evening. The streetlights had come on, creating pools of yellow light on wet pavement. Inside the cafe, the overhead lights seemed brighter by contrast. And the window became more reflective, more mirror than transparency, showing me my own face looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I looked old. That was the simple truth. Lines around my eyes and mouth. Skin that had lost its elasticity, that sagged in places and showed spots from too many years of sun. Hair that had gone completely gray. But under all that aging I could still see traces of who I'd been. Could still recognize the eyes. The shape of the face. The essential structure that time hadn't been able to erase completely. All the versions of me were there in that reflection. 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 and 67. All of them looking back at me through this one old face. All of them still existing somewhere in the layered time that I was just beginning to understand. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Something that might have been gratitude or acceptance or peace or some combination of all three. Felt it in my chest, warm and spreading, not dramatic but present. Real, because I'd made it. I'd survived to 67. Had lived through all those years and all those changes and all those losses. Had watched a city transform and a body age and certainties dissolve. Had kept walking through rain even when I didn't know where I was going or why I was still putting one foot in front of the other. And here I was, still here, still breathing, still capable of sitting by a window and watching rain and feeling something when beauty appeared unexpectedly in the form of light on wet glass. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. Not in any grand cosmic sense. Just in the small personal sense of having lived and continuing to live and finding moments of understanding in the midst of confusion. The rain fell. The reflections merged and separated. The city breathed around me. And I sat there, an old woman in a cafe that used to be a record store, understanding finally that grief and persistence weren't opposites. That loss and continuation were two sides of the same coin. That everything ends and nothing ends and both things are true simultaneously. The rain remembers what we try to forget. That's what I'd thought earlier, walking down Main Street. But sitting there, watching the layers of time visible in glass and rain and reflection, I realized I had it backward. We remember too. We carry it all forward. Every moment, every place, every person. Everything that ever happened to us is still happening, will always be happening, in the layered time we inhabit without fully understanding. The rain just makes it visible. Makes the layers obvious. Shows us that past and present aren't separate but intertwined. Woven together like streams of water running down glass, impossible to separate, ultimately the same substance taking different paths toward the same destination. I sat until the cafe started feeling too warm, too crowded with people and their conversations and their laptops and their complicated drink orders. Sat until my coffee was cold and my knees were stiff from staying in one position too long. Sat until I'd seen what I came to see, learned what I came to learn, even though I hadn't known I was coming to learn anything at all. Then I stood, slowly, gathered my jacket and umbrella, and walked toward the door. Paused at the threshold and looked back one more time. Saw the cafe. Saw the record store. Saw both at once, layered and real and permanent in their impermanence. And I understood, finally, why the rain kept falling. Why it would always keep falling. Because it was the only thing that connected all the layers. The only constant in a world of transformation. The only truth that didn't change no matter how much time passed. The rain falls on what was and what is without making any distinction between them. And that's how we should remember too. I woke the next morning to a sound I hadn't heard in days. Silence. Or not silence exactly, but the absence of rain. After nearly a week of steady percussion against the windows. The sudden lack of sound was louder than the rain had been, made itself known through its very absence. Light came through the curtains differently. Not the usual gray Portland light filtering through clouds and mist, but something brighter. Yellow at the edges where the fabric didn't quite meet the window frame. I lay in bed for a few minutes, orienting myself, listening to the quiet, feeling something shift in the quality of the morning. When I got up and pulled back the curtains, I saw it. Blue sky. Not the deep blue of summer, not complete or cloudless, but blue nonetheless. Actual color in the sky instead of the uniform gray that had covered everything for what felt like months. The clouds were breaking up, moving east, revealing patches of actual atmosphere, actual space between Earth and whatever comes after Earth. The street below was wet but empty of rain. Puddles reflected the sky, making the pavement look like it held pieces of heaven. The buildings across the way were sharper somehow, more defined, their edges clear against the changing sky instead of blurred by falling water. I made coffee the old way, in the percolator that had lived on my counter since the 80s. Let it bubble and hiss while I stood at the window, watching the city wake up. Watching people emerge from buildings and walk with different energy, faster, lighter, freed from the weight of rain even if only temporarily. Everyone in Portland knows the rain will return. That's not faith or pessimism, just meteorological fact. But the breaks matter. The pauses count. I thought about yesterday. About Main Street and the cafe and the woman I'd talked with about rain and staying. About sitting by that window and understanding something I'd been too young to understand when I lived in this city the first time. That nothing disappears. That transformation isn't loss. That the past exists always in the present if you know how to look for it. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. Understanding intellectually that time is layered doesn't mean you've made peace with what the layers contain. I'd spent 45 years carrying the weight of those years, treating memory like burden. Treating the past like something that happened to me instead of something that made me. I drank my coffee, ate toast with butter, simple breakfast that required no thought. And then, because the sky was clearing and my body felt stronger than it had in weeks and something in me said go, I decided to walk. Not back to Main Street. I'd said goodbye to that yesterday, had completed whatever circle needed completing. But to the river, the Willamette, which ran through Portland like an artery. Carrying everything downstream toward the Columbia, toward the ocean, toward whatever comes after cities and memory and rain. I dressed in layers. Good shoes. The rain jacket even though the rain had stopped, because trust in Portland weather is always provisional, always temporary. Grabbed my umbrella out of habit. Left the apartment into morning that felt new, felt like possibility, felt like the world had been washed clean and was starting over. The walk was longer than I remembered. My body reminded me with each block that I was 67, that distance had gotten harder, that what used to be casual was now deliberate. But I didn't mind. Had nowhere to be. No schedule except the one the day provided. Light and dark. Hunger and fullness. The basic rhythms that remain when you strip away everything constructed. Burnside led me west, then south. Past buildings I recognized and buildings I didn't. Past all the changes and transformations and evolutions that had occurred while I was busy getting older. Past coffee shops and dispensaries and bike shops and all the infrastructure of modern urban life. But also past persistence. Past brick that had been brick for a century. Past sidewalks worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Past the fundamental bones of the city that weather and economics couldn't touch. The cracks in the sidewalk were the same or similar enough. Concrete breaks in patterns, finds the weak points, splits along lines of least resistance. Some of these cracks I'd stepped over 30 years ago. Some were new, hard to tell which was which. Time erodes everything at different rates, and memory is unreliable about specifics even when it's accurate about the general shape of things. I reached the waterfront as the sun climbed higher. The clouds were still breaking up, racing east on wind from the ocean. The river was high and brown, swollen with all the rain that had fallen, moving fast. It carried debris, branches and leaves and everything the city had shed, washed down through storm drains and carried away. Nature's cleaning system. Nature's method of forgetting and starting over. The path along the water was nearly empty. Too early for joggers. Too cold yet for casual walkers. Just me and a few other early risers, people walking dogs or heading to work or just moving through the morning because movement was what living things did. We didn't stop until we stopped for good. And even then our atoms kept moving, kept dancing, kept participating in the universe's endless rearrangement of itself. I found a bench overlooking the river and sat down carefully. The wood was damp but not soaking. The morning sun had started doing its work, evaporating the night's rain, sending it back into the atmosphere to fall again somewhere else. The water cycle. Endless. Indifferent. Perfect. I sat for a long time, watching the river move. Brown water carrying silt and runoff and everything the rain had gathered. It would reach the ocean today or tomorrow. Would mix with salt water and lose its identity as river. Would become something else while remaining essentially water. Same molecules, different context. That's what happened to everything. The record store became a cafe. The person under the awning became memory. I became an old woman sitting on a bench, watching water flow toward an ocean I couldn't see but knew was there. Everything transformed. Nothing disappeared, just changed state. A woman walked past with a dog. The dog stopped to sniff near my bench, tail moving with that uncomplicated joy only dogs seem capable of. The woman smiled in my direction, apologetic or friendly or just acknowledging shared space. I smiled back. Small exchange that meant nothing and everything. Proof we were both here. Both alive. Both participating in the morning. They moved on and I watched them go. Both moving with purpose toward somewhere that mattered to them. Everyone moving toward something. Even me, though I'd stopped knowing what years ago. Or maybe I'd been moving toward this. This bench. This river. This morning. This moment of sitting still while everything else moved. The sun was warm now. Actual warmth, not just light. I could feel it on my face, on my hands. Could feel it starting to dry the dampness from my jacket. The wind had shifted, coming from the east now instead of the west. The day was opening up. Becoming something other than rain. I thought about all the versions of myself who'd sat in similar places, watching similar water, trying to understand similar things. The 20-year-old at the record store window. The 30-year-old walking to the lake. The 40-year-old learning to accept solitude. The 50-year-old wondering if this was all there was. The 60-year-old making peace with the answer being yes. All of them were still doing those things. Still sitting and walking and wondering and making peace. Still existing in their particular layers of time, their particular moments of rain or sun or the space between. I hadn't left them behind. I'd brought them with me. Carried them forward. Let them accumulate into this person I was now, this collection of every age I'd ever been, all of them present in this one aging body. And I felt something I could only describe as peace. Not happiness, which was too simple, too dependent on circumstances. But peace. The acceptance of what had been. The release of what might have been. The acknowledgement that I was here, now, having lived the life I'd lived, and that was enough. The river kept moving. Time kept passing. The sun climbed higher. I stood up eventually. Had to. Couldn't sit forever even though sitting forever had its appeal. My knees complained but worked. My back straightened. My body remembered how to move even when my mind wanted to stay still. I walked back toward home, retracing my steps, watching the city continue its business around me. Delivery trucks, buses, people heading to work or coming from night shifts or just moving through space because movement was possible. And stillness would come soon enough for all of us. By the time I reached my apartment, the clouds had cleared completely. The sky was that impossible blue that makes you forget gray ever existed. The puddles were drying, leaving salt lines and sediment. The rain had washed the city clean, and now the sun was erasing the evidence of the washing, and by tomorrow or the day after, the rain would return and the cycle would continue. And none of us would be surprised, because this was Portland and rain was what Portland did. I stood at my window with fresh coffee, looking down at the street. Watching it dry. Watching people move through their mornings. Watching the ordinary miracle of another day arriving, indifferent to whether we noticed its arrival or understood its significance. And I thought about Main Street and the record store and the person who waited. And all the years I'd spent believing that what I'd lost mattered more than what I'd kept. Believing that the ending of things was the important part, the part worth remembering, the part that defined their meaning. But I understood now, finally, what I'd been too young to understand at 20, too busy to understand at 40, too tired to understand at 50. The ending wasn't the point. The transformation wasn't loss. The rain falling on what was and what is without distinction wasn't tragedy. It was just truth. Just the way things worked. Just the universe being honest about its nature. Everything persists. Everything transforms. Both things true. Both things necessary. Both things beautiful if you can learn to see beauty in change instead of only impermanence. The day opened up before me. Empty. Available. Mine to fill or not fill. I could walk again. Could read. Could do nothing. Could exist in the space between intention and action, in the quiet place. Where old people sit and think about rain and remember record stores and feel grateful for having survived long enough to understand what survival means. I poured another cup of coffee. Sat in my chair by the window. Watched the street. Watched the light. Watched the day move forward at its own pace, unhurried, unconcerned with my witnessing. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something that might have been contentment or acceptance or the simple absence of struggle. The release of resistance. The peace that comes from finally understanding that the rain will return because rain returns. And that's not something to mourn but something to expect, to accept, to be ready for. Outside, the last puddle on the corner caught sunlight and glowed like a mirror. A gutter dripped its final drops, irregular and slowing. A soft wind moved through the bare branches of the trees lining the street, making them sway slightly, making shadows dance. And somewhere in the city, on Main Street or Burnside or 100 other streets I'd never walked, water moved toward the river. The river moved toward the ocean. The ocean evaporated into clouds. The clouds moved back over Portland, carrying rain that would fall again. Completing the cycle, continuing the conversation between sky and earth that had been going on since before language existed to describe it. The rain remembers what we try to forget. But sometimes, if you're lucky, if you live long enough, if you survive the waiting and the changing and the slow erosion of certainty, you remember too. Remember that nothing ends. Remember that transformation is just another word for continuation. Remember that the rain falling on your 20-year-old self and your 67-year-old self is the same rain. Connecting all the versions of you across time, across change, across the distance between who you were and who you became. And that remembering, that carrying forward, that acknowledgement that everything matters even when nothing lasts, that's what makes the rain worth falling. That's what makes the street worth walking. That's what makes the years worth living. Even in rain. Especially in rain. Always in rain. That evening, as I knew it would, the rain came back. I heard it first on the window. Soft tapping. Then steady. Then the familiar rhythm I'd known for 50 years. I didn't get up to look. Didn't need to. Just sat in my chair, in the dark apartment, listening. The rain falling on Main Street. On Burnside. On the river. On everything that was and is and will be. Washing it clean. Washing it away. Remembering. Always remembering.